So in our house, there is, in our hallway right next to our garage, or the door that leads to our garage, it's sort of become like this drop zone. And on any given day, you might see a water bottle, a book, a box full of things, a bag, maybe more than one bag, some stray jackets and things like that. Now, if I had it my way, there wouldn't be anything in that little area, right? And in fact, every now and then I'll pick it up and I'll hang my kid's jacket or put the water bottle in the kitchen or try to move a box or just try to find a place for this to go. But somehow, some way, despite my earnest pleas, despite my attempts to help actually lift things up off the ground and away from that area, it somehow always turns back into a drop zone. And it starts with just one little thing, but then slowly it starts to grow over time until it takes over the whole space. Now, some of you probably understand what this feels like, because maybe you have a drop zone in your house, right? Maybe it's the hallway, or maybe it's a spot on the island in your kitchen. Maybe it's a drawer that has sort of become a catch-all. It's a great plug for the decluttering event, right? For the women, right? I was just thinking about that. I need to go to this as well. But maybe it's something like that. And you don't intend for these, spaces to serve that purpose, but it just happens. And it starts with one little thing, and then it slowly takes over. Or maybe you're scrolling on your phone, and you're looking at something, and you click on one random video, or you click on it by accident, and then suddenly your whole feed is now home improvement products, or hot buys at Costco, or in my case, it's alligators in public spaces, okay? I don't know, I just have this really weird thing when I see that, like, I would never want to live in Florida. That's just crazy, right? Or maybe you share a Netflix account, and you like to watch action and drama, but your spouse likes to watch, I don't know, K-drama or cooking shows, right? And then all of a sudden your algorithm is just so messed up, right? We all understand this. Like in life, it doesn't take much for one small thing to start affecting everything around it. And whether that's a bag in the hallway or a random knickknack on the counter, one click on your phone, it just starts to spread. And that's exactly what we see in our passage today. Now, if you've been joining us, or if you're joining us for the first time, we've been walking through the book of Genesis. And a few weeks ago, you'll see on the screen that I talked about how Genesis is split up into two parts. And we're looking at the first part. And in Genesis 1 through 10, it tells the story of God and the world. And specifically, we're looking at why the world needs God's blessing. And the reason is because of the entrance of sin. And so as we've been moving through these chapters, as Pastor Ethan's been taking us from Genesis chapters 1 through 3, we see two things that keep advancing side by side in the book of Genesis. We see this advancement of sin, but we also see the advancement of God's blessing. And so by the time we get here to Genesis chapter 4, we see that sin has slowly spread, and it spread from Adam and Eve, and then now into their family, and then eventually it's going to spread down into society. We're not going to look at all of that, but we're going to focus on this family. And the question that I want to pose, that I want us to think about is, what happens when sin spreads so fast? What happens when sin continues to advance in this world and in our lives and now in our families? That's what we're going to look at today. So if you have your Bibles, or if you don't, you can look up on the screen. We're going to go back and we're going to read Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. And there in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, it says this: Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. So our story, it begins really simply. It begins with two siblings, two offerings, and then two very different responses from God. Now, whenever we read Old Testament narratives, we tend to focus on the wrong things. We want more information than the text actually gives us, so what we do is we tend to fill in the gaps to make a more complete story for us. And so people often read the story of Cain and Abel, and we have all these questions in our head like, okay, what exactly was Cain and Abel offering? Like, what was the difference between Cain, his offering, and Abel's offering? Why did God accept Abel's offering but not Cain's? Was there something wrong with it? Was God just a meat lover and didn't want this, vegan meal? Right? We come up with all these ideas, but when we encounter Old Testament narratives, we have to stop reading between the lines and just read the lines themselves. And when we do that, we see that the text does not focus on the content of the offering. It doesn't matter. It's not the point. The author is instead focusing on Cain's response to the rejection that he received from God for his offering. And the text tells us that Cain was very angry. It literally means that it burned him up. Like he was burning with anger. And that his face became downcast because his pride was wounded. We've all been there. And maybe you've grown up and you feel like that your parents favored your other siblings. They had more freedom. They got off the hook way easier than you. They always got the nicer stuff. I mean, I noticed this every New Year's when we would do our traditional Korean bowing, and we'd get envelopes, and my brother would get a 20, and I'd get $1. It couldn't be more apparent who the favored child was, right? Or maybe, you've had a teacher or a coach who didn't seem to like you that much, or at least that's what you thought, right? So you didn't get the grades or the playing time that you thought you deserved. Or maybe you get passed over for a promotion by someone at work who's not nearly as talented as you or not nearly as hardworking. Or maybe the person that you like, that you have feelings for, they don't reciprocate those feelings and they just want to kind of keep you in the friend zone, right? Like we've all faced some sort of rejection like that. And when we do, we either feel that really burning anger, that sense of injustice inside, or we get that sinking, downcast feeling. And those feelings, that anger, that downcast feeling, these are all symptoms of really of pride in our hearts. We think, what? I'm better than them. Why did they get that? I'm a far more hard worker, far more talented than that person. I obey my parents. Why is my sibling getting all the good stuff? I'm the one that's living the right, normal life. They don't deserve this. She doesn't deserve me. I'm better than that. And these are the thoughts and the feelings that we have. And what's happening is that it's a symptom, again, of pride that's swelling in our hearts. And the resentment starts to grow. And that's what's happening in Cain. And so the question that the text is pushing us to ask is this, what do we do with those feelings? What do we do with anger? What do we do with bitterness? What do we do with resentment that's starting to grow and fester in our souls? Because the way that we respond to that moment can take us down a very dangerous path. And God sees that. He knows that. He sees the slow spread of sin entering Cain's heart. And so he says to him, in chapter 4, verse 6. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast?'" Actually, hold on. I like the way that Renita read that so much better because it was way more gentle. And I think that's how God was actually responding. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And I think what's so fascinating about what's happening here is that God is the one that's making the first move. That Cain is the one that is angry. He has all these emotions inside. He's unraveling internally. And then God comes to him, and God approaches him. I don't know about you, but when my kids start huffing and fussing about something, my first reaction is to tell them to get over it. I don't know what's wrong with you, but get over it. When I can tell that Annie is upset with me, my instinct is just to look the other way and hope that it blows over, which never works. And God does the opposite. God is gentle. God is intentional. He moves towards Cain because Cain is in this very dangerous place. And we understand that when we have these intense feelings and emotions and we don't address them, if we leave them unchecked, then that can turn into some irreversible decisions, and we might regret the things that we say or that we do. And God sees that sin is encroaching on Cain's heart. So he gives Cain a warning, and he paints this very, very vivid picture. He says, if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. Now, in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a belief in this thing called a doorway demon. And this doorway demon was like a spirit that lingered at thresholds. And they would wait for somebody to cross over that threshold so that they could ambush them. And that's the image that God is giving Cain. Like Cain is standing at the doorway and sin is crouching. Some of your translations might say it's lurking. It's waiting. You ever felt that moment before? Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your kids blatantly disobey you. Your spouse says something to you that just really strikes a nerve. A coworker insults you. Someone leaves some sort of absurd comment online. And you feel that surge inside. And you feel this intense emotion and the pride being wounded. And you feel all of that. And there's a moment where you decide, am I going to step back? Or am I going to just plow through that threshold and unleash my anger? And God warned Cain, you're either going to master sin or sin will master you. And Cain had the chance to do the right thing. He had this window of opportunity, this moment to choose what was right. But you see, sin, it spreads when we ignore the warnings. And this is what makes what happens next such a tragedy. Look at verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out in the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. What happens here is, it's so tragic on so many levels, right? It's just a brief mention in our narrative. It's just a sentence or two. But here we see the very first murder take place. And we don't get in this narrative, we don't get Cain's inner dialogue. We don't get, this wrestling with his conscience. There's no visible hesitation. There's just this premeditated act. And Cain is at the threshold of sin. And he makes a very deliberate, the text tells us, very intentional, premeditated decision to cross that line and to kill his own brother. Cain doesn't want mastery over sin, and instead he let it take control over him. And that's how sin works. It encroaches slowly but surely. And if we ignore those warnings, it starts to spread inward in our hearts, and then eventually it spills outward in our actions. And we've all been there. We've done those things. We've said those things when we've felt those things inside, and we just say, I don't care. I'm going to cross this threshold, and I am going to unleash Sheol. But with Cain, the sin, it didn't just stop there. It continued to spread even deeper into his soul. And even as Cain's sin, as it continued to propagate, we see God just continues to pursue him. Look at verse 9. It says, Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, there are two things that are happening here. First, Cain denies any knowledge of where Abel is, which is a flat-out lie. He knows exactly where Abel is because he killed him. Probably left his body out in the field somewhere. And the second thing that we see is Cain denies any responsibility for his brother and for his actions. He says, Am I my brother's keeper? Now, that word keeper actually shows up earlier in Genesis. We looked at in the last couple of weeks. In Genesis 2:15, it says, The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. In other words, to keep it. Same word there. And then in Genesis 3:24, after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim, which are these angelic beings, and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard, it's the same word, to keep the way to the tree of life. So Adam was told to keep the garden. It was part of his original calling, his job description that God gave him. The cherubim were told to guard or to keep the way to the tree of life. It's what they were responsible for. And so when Cain asks, Am I my brother's keeper? He isn't just denying knowledge, he's denying responsibility. And he's rejecting God's design for human care. He's rejecting God's design for accountability. And there's just something just especially infuriating about sin plus denial. Like, I'll never forget this moment. Years ago, I pulled up into the gas station at Costco, and as I got there, I put my car in park, and I'm getting ready to get out of my vehicle. And as I look up, all of a sudden, the car in front of me just reverses and smashes into me and broke my grill. And the driver got out and just looked horrified and apologized. And me wanting to be a good witness and a nice Christian, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, Are you okay? And the person said, I'm so sorry, was very apologetic about the situation, said, we'll pay for the damages. And so we exchanged, information. And so I called my insurance, I filed a claim, but then to my surprise, that driver also filed a claim, claiming that I had hit them. And we had to exchange information. So I called this person. I said, why are you lying? Why would you do that? It was so mind-boggling that, that this person would go to that lengths. And you could just see, like, if you felt something like that before, you understand that it's so angering. And when sin is paired with denial, it just digs deeper. And for Cain, what started out as this emotional response, eventually it moved to this violent action and ultimately to this utter rejection of God's original design for shalom, for wholeness. And you could see the sin spread further and further until there was nowhere else for it to go. So in verse 10, the Lord says, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain's sin, it was so severe that he becomes now the first person to be cursed. In Genesis chapter 3, we saw God curse the serpent, and then he cursed the ground. But now Cain is the one that's put under a curse. Now, this doesn't mean that God put a hex on Cain, like Cain wasn't under a spell or anything like that. To be cursed in the biblical sense means to be removed from God's favor and from his protection. See, when Adam and Eve sinned, they were sent out of the Garden of Eden, but they were still under God's blessing. They could still procreate, they could still work the ground, they could still eat from it. They still had all of that blessing. They were under God's protection and favor. They would just have to work harder to get the food from the ground. But Cain is now driven further east out of Eden, and now he's cut off from his family. And he's alienated from God's presence. And no matter how hard he worked, God says, the ground will not produce food for you, which means he had to find other means of survival. And so for Cain, this perpetual exile, for him it was essentially a death sentence. It was the end of his life as he knew it, and it crushed him. And that's what sin does. Sin ruins relationships. Sin destroys God's design. Sin brings suffering and anguish to our souls. But as much as the spread of sin overcame Cain's life, the amazing thing is that God did not allow sin to completely overcome him. And what we see next in this story is just astonishing. Look at verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. You see that? That's astonishing, isn't it? From the beginning of this story, we see sin slowly spreading inside Cain's heart, spilling over into his actions, digging deeper into his soul. But here, God stops the spread of sin. Cain, he hears this punishment and he can't bear the thought of it, and he protests to God, sort of in the way that maybe a child might protest their punishment for something that they did wrong. But there's no remorse on Cain's part. The text makes that clear. He wasn't sorry for his sin. He just couldn't bear the weight of his consequences. And God does something just so shocking. Look at verse there, right there in verse 15. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain. You know, people have wondered and scholars have debated what that mark of Cain actually was. I remember growing up when I was in high school, my friends and I at church, we would theorize all sorts of things about what that mark was. You know, was Cain himself the mark? Everybody recognized Cain and said, uh-oh, better stay away. That's Cain, because he himself is the mark. Or maybe the mark that God gave him was like a scary face tattoo, So anyone comes like, uh-oh, that's Cain. That's for sure the one that, first murdered somebody. Okay. Or maybe the mark that God gave him was like, I don't know, like the scarlet letter, except it's an M for murderer, right? Just some sort of mark of shame that he would carry around, and everybody would be like, ah, ha, ha. Okay, that's Cain right there. But to understand what this mark is, we need to look at what the word actually means. The word mark that we see in Genesis 4:15, it comes from a Hebrew word called oat. You guys want to say that with me? Oat. Yeah, kind of like oatmeal, but oat, okay? And oat, it means a sign, it means a mark, or it means a symbol. And we see this same word, oat, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 12, after a devastating flood. And there it says, and God said, this is the sign, this is the oat of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. You see, what's happening there in Genesis 9 is that the rainbow became an oat of God's promise. It was a sign, it was a symbol, it was a mark of God's promise that he would never destroy the earth again with the flood. What a gracious gift that was. And in the same way, the oat on Cain was not a sign of the curse. It was not a sign of shame. On the contrary, it was a sign of God's grace over Cain's life. That is not how you would expect the story to end. The first murderer in the Bible is protected by God. But that's the point of the story. You see, as sin propagates in our lives, we see in this text that God pursues us still and that he offers protection. He protects us from the full effects of sin. It's still going to have consequences, but he protects us from the full effects of it. In other words, sin spreads, but God saves. And we see in the story that the sin in his life, in Cain's life, it ran so deep. You see it just go deeper and deeper into his soul. But then you also see in this story that the grace of God was deeper when he offers him that sign. We see the level of guilt in Cain's life was so great. But the love that God had is so much greater. But this sign, it was just a precursor to Jesus, who ultimately interrupts the spread of sin and brings forth complete restoration. What an incredible ending to this story, an unexpected ending to this story. Now, the last time I preached a few weeks ago, I talked about how our family has been playing a video game called Overcooked 2 a lot. And there are some levels, and just think about, if you don't know Overcooked, just think about any video game you've ever played. But in this game, there's some levels that require like absolute perfection. Like you cannot mess up, you cannot burn your food, you cannot fall down a pit. I know it's absurd. Okay, you cannot mess up at all, right? And there are times where we will play and we'll inevitably make a mistake, right? And it doesn't matter if it's like at the very beginning of the level or at the very end, we'll pause the game and we'll restart. We'll start over, we gotta do it again. Wouldn't it be nice if life worked that way? Right? Because if we're honest, we've all been where Cain was. Right? Sin was crouching at the door, waiting, lurking, and then we just crossed that threshold. maybe deliberately, or maybe just because we couldn't control ourselves. And sure, maybe you haven't murdered anyone, I hope. But let's not forget the words of Jesus in Matthew 5:21. It says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." We've all been there. We've all been in that place where we felt that emotion, that anger, and then we decided to just unleash it. But here's the thing. We can't press restart. We can't necessarily redo things in our life. When we cross that threshold, it's been done. And that's an awful feeling when you go through that. And you hate yourself. And you think you're a horrible person, a terrible Christian, an unworthy pastor. But God, in His grace, He does not allow sin to have the final word. So what does this mean for us today? Maybe for some of you, you crossed that threshold earlier this week. Or maybe you crossed it years ago and you feel stuck there. And yes, consequences are real, but God still pursues you. He runs towards you because He loves you deeply. And maybe for some of us in here, we just need to rest in that truth today and just let that soak in. Maybe for some of you, there's a fractured relationship in your family. In Genesis 3, we see the infiltration of sin into the human race. And then here in our text in Genesis 4, we see the impact of that sin on the family. And in an age where we're no longer tolerating toxic relationships and cutting people out of our lives, perhaps God wants us to just re-examine that posture. Or maybe, for some of us, sin is crouching at your door right now. It's just wanting to spread into your life. It desires to have you. But Jesus says you must rule over it. Do what is right. And I just love the tone that we can sense in God as He's speaking to Cain. Because here's the thing, God doesn't demand obedience out of us. He invites us to obedience. He invites us to do the right thing. And the Christian faith isn't just about following a set of rules in order to belong. It's about following the heart of God. But we can only do that. We can only follow His heart if we know His heart. And we can only do that if we know Him deeply. So continue to just be in the Word, read His scriptures, talk to Him in prayer, walk with others in community, be in a small group, and just allow the Spirit to continue shaping and forming your life. And I guarantee you that if we do this, you will begin to see what an amazing, incredible, loving, and kind God that He is. That He is a God who pursues you no matter what you've done. That He's a God who protects. That He is a God who forgives. And that He's a God who loves. Would you pray with me?